The ice storm hit my trailer at 4:23 a.m. on November 21st, 2023, coating everything in a treacherous glaze that could kill a woman my age just stepping outside. At 75, my bones had become weather vanes predicting storms days before they arrived through the deep ache that settled in my arthritic joints. I was heating milk for my morning oatmeal, the cheap instant kind that tastes like cardboard, but stretches my Social Security check through the month when the phone rang, with a sharpness that sliced through the howling wind, battering my aluminum siding. My swollen knuckles made gripping the receiver a small torture, but I managed to get it to my ear before the fourth ring. The trailer groaned ominously in the wind, and through my frost-covered window, I could see my neighbor's fence posts bending like they might snap under the weight of ice. "Grandma Rose." The voice was breathless, young, trembling, with barely contained panic. "It's Emma, your granddaughter. Oh my God, I finally found your number. I've been calling every Peterson in Kansas." My heart hammered so hard, I had to steady myself against the kitchen counter. Emma, Sarah's daughter, 24 now, by my calculations, though I hadn't spoken to her in 4 years, not since the terrible fight that had severed my relationship with my only child, like a blade through bone. "Emma, sweetheart, what's wrong?" My voice came out rusty from disuse. Living alone meant I sometimes went days without speaking to another soul, and I was always surprised by how old my voice had become. "It's Mom, Grandma. She's in the hospital and she's asking for you. She keeps saying your name over and over even when she's barely conscious." Emma's voice cracked with tears. "The doctors aren't sure she's going to make it through the week. We scraped together money for a plane ticket, please. Grandma, please come. She needs to tell you something important before it's too late." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah, my daughter, the child I'd raised alone after her father died in Vietnam, was dying. The same Sarah who'd screamed at me 4 years ago that I was a bitter old woman who poisoned everything with criticism and control. Who'd told me she never wanted to see me again. As Emma's words sank in my vision, blurred, whether from tears or the blood pressure spike that made my ears ring, I couldn't tell. My left leg, weakened by the stroke I'd suffered 2 years earlier, suddenly felt unsteady beneath me. "What kind of sick?" I managed to ask, but my voice was barely a whisper. "Cancer, Grandma. Pancreatic. She hid it from us for months, but it's gotten so bad so fast. The flight's already booked. Denver leaves at 2 p.m. from Wichita. We'll pick you up at the airport at 6:30. Emma was crying harder now. "Please say you'll come. I know you and Mom had your differences, but she's still your daughter, and we're still your family." The phone felt slippery in my trembling hand. Through the window, the ice storm was intensifying, turning the world into a crystalline death trap. Any sensible person my age would stay inside, stay safe, stay warm. But Sarah was dying, and despite everything that had passed between us, she was still my baby girl. "I'll come," I whispered into the phone. "Tell her I'm coming." By 6 a.m., I was dressed in my best traveling clothes, a navy wool coat that smelled of mothballs, and the cedar chest where it had waited since my husband James's funeral 3 years ago. As I packed my single battered suitcase, I found myself touching the photographs that told the story of my broken family. Sarah, at 5, gap-toothed and grinning. Sarah at 16, sullen after I'd remarried without consulting her. Sarah at 35, holding baby Emma with fierce maternal protection. But tucked behind Sarah's baby picture was something I'd almost forgotten about: an old photograph of my mother Margaret, standing beside a tall, dark-haired man who wasn't Henry Thompson, the man I'd called father my entire life. I'd found it years ago, while cleaning out Henry's things after he died. Mother looked young and happy in the photo, wearing a dress I'd never seen, standing close to this stranger, whose face held a kindness I'd never seen in Henry's eyes. I'd always assumed he was just a friend from before she'd married Henry, someone from her past that didn't concern me. I wrapped the photo carefully in tissue paper and placed it in my purse alongside the deed to Henry's old farm the mineral rights document he'd signed over to me when I turned 18, probably out of guilt for the years of abuse I'd endured. The farm had been sold for taxes long ago, but I'd kept the papers because they were the only thing he'd ever given me, besides bruises and nightmares. The drive to Wichita Airport took 3 hours instead of the usual 90 minutes my ancient Honda crawling through snow that had already claimed 2 cars I could see in the ditches. Every few miles, I had to stop when dizziness made the road blur into white nothing. My blood pressure medication rationed to stretch between Social Security checks wasn't enough for this kind of stress. The small commuter plane that finally carried me to Denver felt like a tin can in the turbulent skies. As we descended through storm clouds, I pressed my face to the tiny window and watched the Rocky Mountains rise from the plains. This was Sarah's world, now urban sophisticated, so different from the Kansas wheat fields where I'd raised her. Denver International Airport was overwhelming after the quiet of rural life. The soaring white peaks of the terminal ceiling, the crowds of holiday travelers, the constant noise of conversations in multiple languages, it all pressed in on me like a weight. Navigating the terminal with my arthritic hip and rolling suitcase felt like swimming upstream through thick honey. At baggage claim, I waited 45 minutes for luggage that never came. Canceled connections, they said. Bags still in Chicago. Standing there in the same clothes I'd worn since before dawn, exhausted and disoriented, I tried calling the number Emma had given me. Straight to voicemail. "Hi, this is Emma. Leave me a message and I'll totally get back to you." I tried 3 more times over the next hour. Same result. The voice on the recording was bright and bubbly, but something about its quality bothered me. Too crisp, too professional, like it had been recorded in a studio rather than on a personal phone. By 8 p.m., I was sitting alone near the United customer service desk, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The terminal was beginning to empty as flights were canceled, and travelers gave up their holiday plans, but I had nowhere to go. My trailer in Kansas felt 1,000 miles away, and I couldn't afford another plane ticket, even if flights were available. The realization that Emma's call might have been some kind of mistake was almost too painful to consider. But worse was the growing certainty that I'd become so disconnected from my family that I wouldn't even recognize my granddaughter's voice anymore. "Mrs. Peterson." The voice belonged to a security guard, a patient-looking man in his 60s with kind eyes and graying temples. "I've been watching you sitting here alone for quite a while. Is everything all right?" His name tag read Robert Martinez, and something about his manner suggested this wasn't just routine courtesy. I found myself telling him everything: the early morning call, the desperate flight through the ice storm, my inability to contact the family that had supposedly summoned me. Officer Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his expression growing more concerned as my story unfolded. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I don't mean to upset you, but in my 15 years working airport security, I've seen this situation before." He settled into the chair beside me, his voice gentle but direct. "Are you absolutely certain that call was from your granddaughter?" The question hit me like a slap. "What do you mean?" "We see scams targeting elderly folks, especially around holidays. They research families on social media, learn enough personal details to sound convincing over the phone." He pulled out his radio. "Can you give me the phone number that called you this morning?" With shaking hands, I found the number in my phone's call history. Officer Martinez spoke into his radio, then waited. Within minutes, another security officer approached with a tablet computer. "Mrs. Peterson, that number you received the call from, it's currently active and showing a location within this airport terminal." My blood turned to ice. "What does that mean?" "It means whoever called you claiming to be your granddaughter is here right now, probably waiting to make contact with you." Officer Martinez stood up his hand, moving to his radio again. "And that suggests this isn't a simple case of mistaken identity or family miscommunication." The 2 officers flanked me as we moved through the terminal, following the signal from the phone number. My heart hammered against my ribs as we approached the gate areas, scanning faces in the crowd. Who would do this to an elderly woman? Why lure me hundreds of miles from home?
There, Officer Martinez said quietly, pointing toward a man sitting alone near gate B7 talking on his phone. That's our signal source.
The man looked to be about my age, weathered and lean like a Kansas farmer, wearing an expensive leather jacket that didn't quite fit his frame. As we approached, I could hear his voice, and my stomach dropped as I recognized it, not the voice of my granddaughter, but something masculine, older, familiar, in a way that made my skin crawl.
I told you to sound more upset, Katie. The old woman needs to believe her daughter is dying.
Officer Martinez stepped forward, his badge visible.
Sir, I need to see some identification and ask you a few questions.
The man looked up, his face cycling through surprise, calculation, and finally resignation. When he saw me, his expression settled into something that might have been shame mixed with defiance.
Hello, Rose,
he said, ending his phone call. It's been a long time. I stared at him for several heartbeats before the recognition hit me fully. Marcus Thompson, son of Tom Thompson, Henry's eldest boy from his first marriage. Tom had been 16 years older than me, and long gone by the time I was old enough to form clear memories, but I remembered his resentment, the way he'd looked at me like an intruder in his father's house. Marcus had that same look now, bitter, entitled, calculating.
What have you done?
I whispered, sinking into the nearest chair as the full implications crashed over me.
What did you do to me? Officer Martinez was speaking into his radio again, calling for backup, but I barely heard him. My mind was reeling as I tried to process the elaborate cruelty of what had been done to me. The desperate drive through the ice storm, the terrifying flight, the hours of agonizing worry about my daughter, all orchestrated by this man for reasons I couldn't fathom. I needed to get your attention. Rose, Marcus said, his voice matter-of-fact, as if manipulating an elderly woman was just another business transaction. You've been ignoring my letters for months, avoiding my calls, pretending you don't know about the oil money.
What oil money? But even as I asked, pieces were falling into place. The official-looking letters I'd been receiving and throwing away, assuming they were scams. The deed to Henry's farm that I'd carried all these years, thinking it was worthless.
Marcus pulled out a manila folder and spread documents across the small table between us, ignoring the security officers who were now positioned to prevent his escape. Your father's farm sits on top of one of the largest oil deposits discovered in Kansas in the past decade, Rose. Those mineral rights you inherited in 1966, they've been generating income since 2020.
The numbers on the bank statements made my vision blur. Monthly deposits of $3,000, sometimes $5,000. An escrow account in the name of Rose Thompson containing nearly $4 million money that had been accumulating for 3 years while I'd been living on government cheese and generic soup.
I never got any money, I whispered. I never even knew there was oil.
Because you disappeared, Rose. As far as the state of Kansas is concerned, Rose Thompson vanished in 1966 when you married and changed your name. The oil companies have been trying to pay you for 3 years, but they couldn't find you.
Officer Martinez was reading over the documents, his expression grim. Sir, regardless of any legitimate business you might have with Mrs. Peterson, you've committed fraud by impersonating her granddaughter to lure her here under false pretenses. That was my daughter, Katie,
Marcus said, not seeming to care that he was confessing to a crime.
She's got a talent for voices. Has since she was little. Your daughter called me, I said, the pieces of the deception becoming clear. She pretended to be Emma, pretended Sarah was dying. We needed to get you somewhere we could have this conversation without you hanging up or calling the police. Marcus leaned forward, his cologne sharp in the recycled airport air. Because there's something else you need to know, Rose. Something about your precious daughter, Sarah, and what she's been doing while you've been living in poverty.
Before I could ask what he meant, another folder appeared on the table. This one contained photographs that made my breath catch in my throat. Sarah's house, not a modest home, as I'd imagined, but a sprawling 2-story colonial in what looked like an expensive Denver suburb. Sarah herself, looking healthy and prosperous, standing beside a BMW that probably cost more than I'd earned in the last 5 years. But the photograph that destroyed me was a family vacation picture. Sarah, Emma, and Tommy at some tropical resort, all of them tanned and smiling, wearing matching t-shirts that proclaimed Peterson Family Adventures 2022. They looked happy, relaxed, wealthy, everything I'd hoped for them, but also everything I'd been excluded from.
This is how your family's been living while you've been rationing your heart medication. Marcus said, his voice mixing genuine anger with calculated manipulation. Your daughter, who supposedly couldn't afford to maintain contact with you, has been taking vacations to the Caribbean and driving luxury cars.
How did you get these? My hands shook as I studied the photos, looking for signs they were fake, but the details were too authentic. Sarah's distinctive smile, Tommy's way of holding his left shoulder slightly higher from an old injury, Emma's habit of tilting her head when she was genuinely happy.
Private investigator. Cost me most of my savings, but I needed to understand why Rose Thompson was impossible to find when her daughter was living so well, just a few hundred miles from the original farm. Marcus pulled out more documents, bank records, property deeds, business registrations that made my head spin.
Sarah owns a successful marketing firm, Rose, has for 8 years now, makes about $300,000 annually, owns 2 properties, has investment accounts most people never dream of. The betrayal was so complete, I couldn't process it all at once. Sarah, who I'd worried about constantly since her divorce, who I'd assumed was struggling as a single mother, had been living a life of luxury while I'd been counting pennies and skipping medications.
But she cut me off, I whispered. She said she never wanted to see me again. She cut you off because having a poor elderly mother cramped her image as a successful businesswoman. Because it was easier to pretend you didn't exist than deal with the guilt of her prosperity while you suffered. Marcus leaned closer, and I could smell his excitement, the satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this revelation for years.
But here's the part that's really going to interest you, Rose. Want to know how your daughter built that successful business where she got the startup capital for a firm that now employs 15 people?
I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself from nodding.
Oil money, Rose? Your oil money.
The words made no sense initially. That's impossible. You just said the money's been sitting in escrow because they couldn't find me.
Not all of it. There were earlier oil leases, smaller companies that did business differently in the late 90s and early 2000s. When they couldn't find Rose Thompson, they looked for next of kin. Your daughter was easy to find.
He spread out bank records that made the room spin around me. Deposits to Sarah Peterson's business accounts starting in 1999 and continuing for 15 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars marked as mineral rights payments and oil royalty distributions. Your daughter has been collecting oil money from your father's farm for 24 years, Rose. Money that legally belonged to you. Money she used to build her business empire while you've been living in poverty. Officer Martinez was studying the documents over my shoulder, his expression incredulous.
Ma'am, if these records are accurate, this represents a substantial case of financial fraud. Your daughter has been stealing from you for decades.
The pain in my chest was so sharp, I wondered if I was having a heart attack. Every financial struggle since James's death, every choice between food and medicine, every night lying awake worried about rent, all of it had been unnecessary. My own daughter had been stealing the money that could have made my golden years comfortable and secure.
Why are you telling me this? I asked Marcus, though I suspected I already knew.
Because I want justice. My father was Henry Thompson's biological son, his firstborn, and he got nothing when the old man died. Everything went to you, the adopted daughter. Marcus's voice hardened with decades of resentment. Tom spent his whole life believing he'd been cheated, died believing it. I want our family to get the share we deserve. He pulled out legal documents, lawsuits already prepared. I'm filing fraud charges against your daughter tomorrow morning. Civil suit, criminal charges, IRS investigation for tax evasion, the works. But if you're willing to be reasonable, if you're willing to acknowledge that those mineral rights should have been shared between Henry's children.
What do you want? Half the oil money. split between your family and mine the way it should have been from the beginning. Your daughter returns what she's stolen, we divide the ongoing royalties 50-50, and everyone gets what they deserve."
He opened his expensive watch, probably purchased with oil money that should have been mine. "You have until midnight to decide. Call your daughter, tell her what's coming, see what she has to say when she realizes her theft is about to be exposed." As Officer Martinez began reading Marcus his rights for fraud and elder abuse, I sat in that airport chair feeling like my entire life had been a lie. My daughter, who I'd loved and worried about and missed desperately for 4 years, had been living in luxury built on money stolen from me. The family I'd thought had abandoned me had actually been prospering beyond my wildest dreams just without me. But underneath the betrayal and pain was something else, a spark of anger that I hadn't felt since I was young. I'd survived Henry Thompson's abuse, 2 marriages, widowhood, poverty, and isolation. I'd been knocked down more times than I could count, but I'd always gotten back up. This time would be no different. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized but hadn't called in 4 years. Sarah's business line, listed in the documents Marcus had shown me. She answered on the second ring, her voice professional and confident. "Peterson Marketing Solutions, this is Sarah." "Hello, Sarah," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "This is your mother. I'm in Denver, and I think it's time we had a conversation." The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was small and shocked nothing like the business executive who'd answered the phone. "Mom, how did you... Where are you?" I thought. She trailed off, and I could hear her mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much damage control she needed to do. "I'm at the airport, Sarah, about 20 miles from your house, the house you bought with my money." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear her moving around, probably pacing the way she used to when caught in childhood lies. I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "What money?" "The oil money from your grandfather's farm, Sarah. The money you've been stealing from me for 24 years, while I've been living in poverty, thinking my family didn't care enough to stay in touch." "Mom, you don't understand. It's not that simple. The legal situation is complicated." "No, it's not complicated. It's theft. You've been stealing from me while I've been eating government cheese and skipping medications because I couldn't afford them." I could hear her breathing, could almost see her frantically trying to construct a defense. "Where are you getting this information? Who's been telling you these lies?" "Marcus Thompson, Tom's son. He's got bank records, Sarah. Photographs of your house, your cars, your family vacations. He knows everything." "Marcus Thompson." Her voice went flat dangerous. "That bastard has been harassing me for months, claiming his family deserves money they're not entitled to." "Mom, he's lying to you. He's trying to use you to get money that was legally paid to me as your next of kin. Then explain the bank records. Explain why you've been living like a millionaire while your mother chose between food and medicine." "Because I was protecting those assets. When the oil companies couldn't find you, they traced the mineral rights to your legal heir, me. I was safeguarding that money until we could reconcile, until I could figure out how to approach you without it seeming like charity." The lie was smooth practiced, but I could hear the desperation underneath it. "Protecting it by spending it on Caribbean vacations? I was investing it, building something that could benefit our whole family. Mom, if you'd just let me explain in person." "I'm at the airport Marriott, room 1247. I interrupted. "If you want to explain, come here and do it, face to face. Bring your financial records, bring your legal justification, bring whatever proof you have that you weren't stealing from your own mother." "Mom, I can't just drop everything." "Then don't. But know that Marcus Thompson is filing criminal charges tomorrow morning. He's got enough evidence to destroy your business and possibly send you to prison. So you decide what's more important, your evening plans or your freedom." I hung up before she could respond, my heart hammering in the dangerous rhythm that meant my blood pressure was spiking again. The adrenaline that had carried me through the call was already fading, leaving me exhausted and shaky. Officer Martinez was finishing his paperwork on Marcus, who would be spending the night in jail before his arraignment in the morning. Katie Thompson, the daughter who'd impersonated my granddaughter, was being questioned in another part of the terminal.
Mrs. Peterson, Officer Martinez said gently, "We can arrange a hotel room for you tonight. Help you book a flight back to Kansas tomorrow if you'd prefer not to meet with your daughter. But I'd come too far, endured too much to run away now." "No," I said, surprising myself with the determination in my voice. "I want to hear what she has to say. I want to look her in the eye while she tries to justify 24 years of theft." The hotel room Marcus had booked was small and sterile, but it had something my trailer in Kansas didn't: room service and cable television. As I waited for Sarah to arrive, I ordered the most expensive item on the menu, a steak dinner that cost more than I usually spend on groceries in a week, and charged it to the room. If Marcus Thompson could manipulate me into coming here, he could pay for a decent meal. The knock on my door came at 10:30 p.m. sharp and hesitant at the same time. When I opened it, Sarah stood in the hallway looking exactly like the photographs Marcus had shown me: prosperous, well-dressed, healthy, but also somehow smaller than I remembered. Behind her stood Emma, my granddaughter, tall and beautiful and unmistakably real. "Hello, Mom," Sarah said, her voice careful and controlled. "You look—" She paused, taking in my worn clothes, my obvious exhaustion, the way I held myself slightly bent from the hip pain. "You look older."
"Poverty will do that to a person," I replied, stepping back to let them enter. "Especially when your own daughter is stealing the money that could have prevented it."
Emma moved to hug me, and for a moment I was 8 years old again, desperate for affection from someone who shared my blood. She was warm and solid and smelled like expensive shampoo, and when she whispered, "I've missed you so much, Grandma," in my ear, I almost started crying. But I couldn't let emotion derail this conversation. Too much had been hidden, too many lies told, too much damage done. Sit down, Sarah," I said, settling into the room's single chair while they took the bed. "And start talking." For the next 3 hours, the truth came out in painful pieces. The oil money had indeed started in 1999, just as Marcus claimed. Sarah had been notified as my next of kin when the first small oil company couldn't locate Rose Thompson. Initially, she'd intended to tell me about it to share the modest payments that were coming in. But then came our terrible fight in 2019, the argument that had severed our relationship and left both of us too proud and too hurt to make the first move toward reconciliation. I was so angry, Sarah admitted, tears streaming down her face. "You'd criticized every decision I'd made about my divorce, told me I was abandoning my family just like my father did. It felt like no matter what I accomplished, no matter how hard I tried, you still saw me as a failure. So you decided to steal from me as punishment." "I decided to hold on to the money until you apologized. Until you acknowledged that maybe I wasn't the terrible daughter you seemed to think I was." She wiped her eyes with tissues Emma handed her. "But then months passed, and the amount kept growing, and I started using it for business investments."
"And the longer you waited, the harder it became to tell the truth."
"Exactly. By the time I realized how much money was involved, how much it could have helped you, I was too ashamed to admit what I'd done. I'd spent 3 years living off your inheritance while you were struggling, and I didn't know how to face that." Emma had been listening in horrified silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed she'd had no idea about any of this. "Mom," she said finally, "how could you let Grandma live in poverty while we were going on vacation to Cabo?" "Because I'm a coward," Sarah replied simply. "Because I was too proud and too scared to admit I'd made a terrible mistake and let it go on far too long." The raw honesty was painful, but also somehow healing. For the first time in years, Sarah wasn't trying to manage my perception of her, wasn't performing the role of successful daughter. She was just a 54-year-old woman who'd made catastrophic errors in judgment and was finally admitting it.
"What happens now?" I asked. Now I make it right," Sarah said firmly. "I'll liquidate whatever assets I need to liquidate, sell. properties, take out loans, whatever it takes to return every penny I took from you, plus interest. It's going to destroy my business, probably bankrupt me, but that's what I deserve. And Marcus Thompson's lawsuit, let him file it. He's not wrong that his father got a raw deal from Grandpa Henry, but the legal reality is that those mineral rights were legitimately transferred to you, and I was legally authorized to act as your heir when you couldn't be located. He doesn't have standing to sue. Emma was shaking her head. This is insane. Our whole life has been built on stolen money, and now we're going to lose everything because Mom was too proud to have an honest conversation with her own mother. Not everything, I said quietly. You're not going to lose your family. That's what I came here to save, and it's what I'm going to leave with. Over the next 6 months, Sarah made good on her promise to return the money. She sold her house, downsized to a modest apartment, let several employees go, and took out a substantial loan against her remaining business assets. It was brutal to watch my successful daughter reduced to clipping coupons and driving a 10-year-old Honda, but it was also strangely redemptive. For the first time since she was a child, Sarah needed me, not my money. Ironically, I now had more money than I knew what to do with, but my emotional support, my practical wisdom, my presence in her life. The oil money gave us the foundation for reconciliation, but the real healing happened in smaller moments. Sarah calling to ask my advice about budget grocery shopping, Emma driving to Kansas to help me find a nicer place to live, Tommy visiting for a weekend and teaching me to use social media so I could see pictures of my family whenever I wanted. The financial mess took months to untangle, involving lawyers, accountants, and tax specialists who charged fees that made my eyes water. But by the end of it, I was the legal owner of nearly $3 million in accumulated oil royalties, with ongoing payments that would ensure I never had to worry about money again. More importantly, I was part of my family again. Sarah and I started having weekly dinner dates. Emma called me every Sunday to share stories from her job at the community clinic, and Tommy sent me funny memes that I pretended to understand. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, still echoes of the old hurt, but it was real and honest and growing stronger each month. The surprise came 9 months after that horrible night in Denver, when Sarah called with news that would change everything I thought I knew about my past. Mom, I've been working with a genealogy researcher. She said, her voice nervous in the way it got when she was about to reveal something significant. Trying to understand more about our family history, about why Grandpa Henry made the choices he made about his will and the mineral rights. What did you find? I found your real father. She drove to Kansas that weekend with a folder full of documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates that told a story I'd never known. My mother, Margaret, had been married before Henry Thompson. She'd been Margaret Harper, wife to a railroad worker named Edward Harper, who died in an industrial accident just 2 months before I was born. Henry Thompson wasn't your biological father, Sarah explained gently as we sat in my new living room, a comfortable house I'd bought with oil. Money nothing fancy, but warm and well-maintained. Edward Harper was. Henry married your mother when you were 6 months old and formally adopted you when you were 10 to ensure you had legal inheritance rights. The adoption papers I'd signed as a sick 10-year-old suddenly made sense. Henry hadn't been claiming me as his natural child, he'd been legally protecting my right to inherit as his chosen daughter, regardless of blood relation. There's more. Sarah continued, pulling out additional documents. Edward Harper had life insurance through the railroad company. When he died, the money was supposed to go to his wife and unborn child, you. But your mother was too overwhelmed with grief and poverty to claim it. The insurance money had been sitting in an unclaimed funds account for 75 years, earning interest, waiting for Edward Harper's daughter to prove her identity and claim her inheritance. With the genealogy research and DNA testing Sarah had arranged, I was now able to claim nearly $400,000 that had been waiting for me since before I was born. Your real father was trying to take care of you even before you knew you existed. Emma said, tears streaming down her face as we looked at Edward Harper's employment photo from the railroad company archives. He was young and handsome, with kind eyes and a strong jaw, nothing like the harsh, bitter man who'd raised me. He bought that life insurance policy because he wanted to make sure his child would have opportunities he'd never had.
As I held the photograph of the father I'd never known, I understood something about my life that had never made sense before. Henry Thompson's resentment, his drinking, his tendency to call me that Harper girl. When he was angry, he'd been raising another man's child, honoring a promise to a dead wife, trying to do right by a daughter who reminded him daily of his own inadequacy as a replacement father.
The mysterious items I'd found over the years suddenly had meaning. The small locket engraved EH that I'd discovered in my mother's sewing box wasn't a friend's initial. It was Edward Harper's, a keepsake my mother had treasured. The photograph of her with the kind-faced stranger hadn't been a casual acquaintance. It had been her first husband, my real father.
"Why didn't she ever tell me?"
I asked.
"I think she was protecting you,"
Sarah replied. Henry was already struggling to accept you as his daughter. If you'd known he wasn't your real father, it might have made the abuse worse. With Edward Harper's insurance money and the ongoing oil royalties, I had more financial security than I'd ever dreamed of. But what meant more was the knowledge that I'd been loved before I was born, that a man I'd never met had worked extra shifts and saved money and bought insurance because he'd wanted his child to have a better life than he'd had. I used Edward Harper's insurance money to establish a scholarship fund for children who'd lost parents in industrial accidents. The scholarship was small enough to help with college expenses, not enough to change lives completely, but it felt like the right way to honor the father who'd tried to provide for me from beyond the grave. Sarah and I worked together on the scholarship fund, just as we worked together on managing the oil money investments and deciding which charities to support. It wasn't the relationship we'd had when she was young. We were both too old and too scarred for that kind of easy intimacy, but it was better in some ways. Built on honesty instead of illusion, on choice rather than obligation.
2 years after that terrible ice storm morning, when Marcus Thompson's daughter had called, pretending to be my granddaughter, I received a phone call that completed the circle of forgiveness I'd been learning to walk.
"Mrs. Peterson?" The voice was young, female, shaking with nerves. "This is Katie Thompson, Marcus's daughter. I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what I did, but I need help, and I don't know where else to turn." Katie was 26, trapped in an abusive marriage, working 2 minimum-wage jobs to support herself and her 4-year-old daughter, while her husband gambled away their rent money. She'd been saving to leave him for months, but every time she got close to having enough for an apartment deposit, some crisis would force her to spend her escape fund. "I heard about your scholarship programs," she continued, "about how you help women who are trying to build better lives. I know I don't deserve your help after what I did, but my daughter, she deserves better than this." I listened to her story without interrupting, hearing echoes of my own desperation at 18, when I'd fled Henry Thompson's house with nothing but the clothes I wore and the baby growing inside me. Katie Thompson had made terrible choices, had participated in a cruel scheme to manipulate and defraud me. But she was also a young mother trying to protect her child from violence. "Can you come to Kansas?" I asked. "To our office in Hayes. We can help you develop a safety plan, find temporary housing, connect you with legal services for the divorce."
"You would do that after what my father and I did to you?"
"I would do it because of what you did to me," I corrected her. "Because your father's scheme, terrible as it was, brought my family back together and gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things if we're willing to learn instead of just being destroyed." Katie Thompson arrived in Kansas 3 weeks later with her daughter ironically named Emma after the granddaughter she'd once impersonated. She's living in transitional housing now, working part-time at our foundation while finishing her degree in business management, building the kind of life she wants her daughter to inherit. "I don't understand why you're helping me,"
she said during one of our weekly check-ins. I was part of something that could have destroyed your family. But it didn't destroy my family, I told her. It saved my family. Your father's cruelty exposed my daughter's deception, which forced us to have the conversations we'd been avoiding for years. In trying to tear us apart, he accidentally brought us back together. As I write this, sitting in the Edward Harper Memorial Office of the Thompson Family Foundation, we kept Henry's name because his mineral rights money funds most of our work. But Edward's name reminds us that love can transcend death. I'm watching my great-granddaughter play in the small playground we built behind our building. Emma Thompson, Katie's daughter, is 5 now and calls me Great-Grandma Rose, though she has no idea of the complicated history that brought us together. Sarah stops by most afternoons on her way home from her new job managing a nonprofit housing organization. She makes less money now than she did when she owned her own business, but she seems happier, more at peace with herself. The guilt that poisoned her for years has been replaced by purposeful work, helping other people find stable housing. Emma, my real granddaughter, graduated from medical school last month and is starting her residency at Denver General Hospital. She calls me every Sunday, just as she promised she would, and those conversations are the highlight of my week. Tommy is engaged to a lovely young woman named Maria, and they're planning a wedding next spring that will be the first family celebration we've all attended together in 8 years. The phone call that started this journey, "Fly out, Grandma, we want you here for Thanksgiving," had been a lie designed to manipulate me. But it had also been in its way a prophecy. My family did want me there for Thanksgiving and for Christmas and for birthdays and graduations and all the ordinary moments that make up a shared life. They just hadn't found the courage to say it until a stranger's cruelty forced them to choose between permanent estrangement and the hard work of rebuilding what we'd broken. Marcus Thompson served 18 months in federal prison for elder abuse and fraud. When he was released, he sent me a letter, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that his methods had been wrong, even if his underlying grievance had been legitimate. I wrote back telling him that I'd established a small trust fund for Tom Thompson's other descendants, not because I legally owed them anything, but because family should take care of family when possible. I'm 77 now, healthier and happier than I've been in decades, surrounded by family and meaningful work, and the kind of financial security I never dared dream of when I was eating generic soup and rationing my medications. But what I'm most grateful for isn't the money, or the recognition, or even the comfortable house Sarah and I bought together, so she could be close enough to check on me daily. What I'm most grateful for is the phone call that changed everything. The lie that led to truth, the betrayal that led to reconciliation, the stranger who tried to destroy my family, but ended up giving us back to each other instead. Next week, Sarah, Emma, and Tommy are flying to Kansas for Thanksgiving dinner at my house. Emma, the real Emma, my beloved granddaughter, called to confirm the menu, and her voice was warm with genuine affection as she said, "I can't wait to see you, Grandma. I love you so much." This time, when I pack my bags for a family visit, it won't be because I've been manipulated by strangers or lured by false promises. It will be because I'm loved, because I'm wanted, because I belong somewhere again. And that more than all the oil money in Kansas is worth everything I endured to find it.